This episode's sponsored by CuriosityStream, which now comes free with Nebula. Details in the description box below. Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and over the years, I've reviewed a few films about infamous criminals in history. But I figured for the next two episodes, why not cover the richest and most notorious one of all, Pablo Escobar. In the smash hit Netflix series Narcos, its first two seasons tells the story of his rise and fall. From his roots as a small-time smuggler in Medellin, Colombia, to quickly becoming the richest drug lord who ever lived. At the height of his power, he was estimated to be worth $30 billion, and he used his illicit fortune to wage war on Colombia itself. In less than 10 years, he would be responsible for the deaths of thousands, from journalists, cops, judges, politicians, and even civilians. His reign of terror was so brutal that it would change his designation from merely a wanted criminal to becoming the world's first narco-terrorist. As a nation under siege, Colombia's national police worked side by side with America's Drug Enforcement Administration to bring down Pablo Escobar. Two of the agents part of that elite team, our main protagonists, are based on and named after Javier Pena and Steve Murphy. Javier Pena later wrote of their experiences by saying, and I quote, "We were really just two small-town guys who got the opportunity to work the case of a lifetime, to be frontline soldiers in the greatest manhunt in history." But how much of their manhunt is historically accurate? And how much did Netflix dramatize? Well, my fellow history buffs, I'll reveal all this and more as I cover the first two seasons of Narcos. I'm going to tell the story of Pablo Escobar in chronological order, and as we move along, I'm going to point out which parts are made up and which parts were true. This is Season 1 of Narcos. When the show begins, Narcos tells the story of how the cocaine trade had its roots in Chile in 1973. This was the same year the CIA supported the overthrow of democratically elected socialist president Salvador Allende by the military dictator Augusto Pinochet, who carried out a ruthless reign of terror, and we're told during this time he eliminated drug trafficking in his country by simply killing all the traffickers. Although Pinochet did bring Chilean drug trafficking to a halt in the early years of his rule, I wouldn't read too much into it. He was simply taking out the competition. He once famously said, "Not a leaf moves in Chile if I don't move it." During the 1980s, he flooded Europe and America with cocaine and used the profits to keep himself in power. Now, whilst cocaine did have a dramatic start in Chile, it wasn't the only country producing it. Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia would be the biggest suppliers to Colombia in the years to come. Anyway, out of this mass grave, we see one man has survived Pinochet's firing squad, a drug chemist called Mateo Moreno, also known as Cockroach due to his near brush with death. Narcos credits him as the one who introduced cocaine to Colombia, but his character is made up. He's really there just to introduce the audience into the world of Colombian drug traffickers. But unlike Cockroach, the ones portrayed on screen were real people and the future founders of the Medellin cartel. Upon his arrival, he has supposedly three choices of who he wants to work with. First up,
the Ochoa brothers, Jorge. That's Fabio on the horse. A typical Colombian smuggling family. They were smart and rich. The Cockroach felt the high life had made him too soft.
I wouldn't call them soft, but they were certainly the least violent out of the Medellin founders. As well as smuggling, they also prided themselves as horse traders, cattle ranchers, and restaurant owners.
Another possible partner was Jose Rodriguez Gacha, nicknamed the Mexican for his love of tequila and sombreros.
Cockroach passes him up too, this time for being too violent. The show references a real event when Gacha sent armed men to storm a house party to murder his old business partner, Gilberto Molina, along with nearly 20 of his guests. But this didn't take place by 1973, but on February 27th, 1989, and Gacha himself wasn't present. Anyway, this leaves Goldilocks here with one last choice, Pablo Escobar, and his introduction is pretty accurate. Granted, he wasn't boss yet by 1973, but it's a minor detail, because the complexity of his future operation is all there for us to see. In the early 70s, Pablo smuggled everything from counterfeit jeans, alcohol, electronics to cigarettes. In fact, Pablo's reputation grew to prominence during the Marlboro Wars, Narcos, a conflict where smugglers literally killed each other over cigarettes. And one of the greatest lessons he learned during this time was how easily corrupted Colombian society was. He would bribe cops and customs officials to allow his caravans of trucks safe passage. Almost everyone had a price, and for those who couldn't be bought, well, he had an offer for them as well. Pablo would point out the one truck he had that wasn't carrying contraband, but armed men. The two choices Pablo gave would set the benchmark throughout his career, to either take his money or die.
Tranquilo. Ustedes pueden aceptar mi negocio o aceptar las consecuencias. Plata o plomo. Ustedes eligen. Listo, pues.
In the next scene, Pablo Escobar and his cousin Gustavo Gaviria meet Cockroach in a restaurant, and his character is the one who introduces them to cocaine and its enormous potential to get rich quick. Whilst a kilo in Colombia would set you back by $1,000, if you brought that same kilo to Miami, its street value would skyrocket to $80,000. Not only that, but you couldn't pick a better time to smuggle cocaine into America than during the 1970s. Cocaine was barely a blip on the American government's radar. It hadn't achieved the same notoriety other drugs had, like heroin. Instead, it was perceived to be a cool drug for the in crowd, for the rich and famous. Also, the penalties for getting caught with cocaine were less severe. For example, in the 1970s, a kilo could get you charged with something like 13 months in prison, whereas today you'd get 10 years. Pablo Escobar immediately saw the value behind this wonder drug, but it wasn't Cockroach who introduced him to it, but a Colombian drug chemist called Ataleo Gonzalez. No picture of him exists, but he and other chemists would smuggle coca paste from Ecuador, Peru, and Bolivia, and they would cook it in a drug lab called a kitchen. These would often be in two-story houses in the barrios of Medellin. They would run 24/7, and they would mix the coca paste with various chemicals and heat it to high temperatures to create cocaine. By 1976, Pablo devoted his organization to only smuggling coke, and in no time at all, his first trip netted him exorbitant profits.
Listo, vendemos los carros y volvemos al laboratorio.
Pero ¿para qué chucha nos vamos a devolver al laboratorio, weón?
Pues porque son 4 guardabarros por cada carro. 5 kilos por cada guardabarro, 20 kilos por carro. Por 3 carros, 60 kilos.
O sea, $9 de ganancia por gramo. ¿Qué?
9.000 por kilo. Yo 540,000
Narcos then jumps forward in time to Miami 1979, and we see Steve Murphy's backstory. He's one of the 2 DEA agents who went after Pablo Escobar, and he acts as the show's narrator, the other agent being Javier Peña. Now, the biggest thing I have to point out when it comes to these guys is that they weren't present for many of the events we see in Season 1. In real life, they didn't get involved until much later. For example, although Steve Murphy did serve in Miami, this wasn't until 1987. The reason why Narcos makes these changes to the timeline is because they want to have Murphy and Peña's story running concurrently with Escobar's. That way things make more sense when Steve Murphy narrates and tells the story of how cocaine was smuggled to the US in the early days.
The Lion was one of the first guys to ever bring coke into Miami. His contact was a crazy nut job named Carlos Lader, half Colombian, half German, and 100% playboy. Big fan of John Lennon and Adolf Hitler. Go figure.
So these two characters are somewhat based on real people. Carlos Lader was one of the founding members of the Medellin cartel, and just like the show accurately said, he was a pro-Nazi hippie. Very contradictory figure, and he would one day smuggle the bulk of Pablo's cocaine to the US. The Lion, on the other hand, is a fictional character, but he is inspired by an American smuggler called George Young. Johnny Depp portrayed him in the 2001 movie Blow. George Young was sent to prison in 1974 for flying in 660 pounds of marijuana from Mexico. His cellmate was Carlos Lader, who was in there for stealing cars, and when he found out about George Young's skills as a smuggler, he asked him if he knew anything about cocaine. In 1975, the pair were released from prison, and they flew down to Colombia to meet Pablo Escobar. The first plane they flew to America for him carried 250 kilos, worth $10 million, and that was just the beginning. Eventually, Carlos Lader became so rich he bought an island in the Bahamas called Norman's Key and turned it into a refueling stop between Colombia and Miami. And like some sort of James Bond villain, he had armed guards patrolling the beaches with a fleet of small planes and huts filled with cocaine, gasoline, and guns. Carlos also turned the private island into his own Sodom and Gomorrah, where naked women would greet his friends at the airstrip and treat them with drug-fueled orgies. In just a few years, cocaine exploded onto the scene, and by 1979, a violent violent turf war between rival Colombian smugglers broke out on the streets of Miami, quickly turning it into the murder capital of America. And as Narcos accurately depicts, the Dade County morgue was overflowing with so many bodies that they had to rent a refrigerated Burger King truck for extra storage. Meanwhile, back in Colombia, Narcos takes creative license at the time when Pablo Escobar was arrested by DAS. They're like the Colombian equivalent of the FBI, and this happened around May 1976. In the show, Pablo has these guys on his payroll, and they seize his truck smuggling cocaine in order to shake him down for more money. They get the idea from Cockroach, who also feels like he isn't getting his fair share, and he gets his comeuppance for it later on. Pablo then goes down to the station himself, but refuses to renegotiate, so they arrest him, take his fingerprints, and put him through the system. That famous mugshot we all know comes directly from this arrest. Now, in real life, these DAS agents were honest cops, and they didn't just arrest Pablo, but also his cousin Gustavo and a few other guys coming back from a drug run to Ecuador. After a few months in prison, they eventually got out by bribing a judge, but Pablo made sure to also kill the two cops who originally arrested him. Since I have your attention, I thought I'd mention that whilst my Narcos Season 1 review will be split up into parts 1 and 2 on YouTube, you can watch it right now in its entirety over on Nebula. Nebula is a streaming service made by creators where we release content early, ad-free, and even show exclusive Nebula originals that you can't find anywhere else. It's also a platform without the restrictions of advertiser-friendly policies you'd find elsewhere. So basically, any videos of mine that need to be heavily edited or go missing will have no problem being uploaded to Nebula the way they were meant to be seen. And what's more is that Nebula comes free with CuriosityStream, which is a subscription streaming service that has nothing on it but documentaries, including history, and you can get them both for just 26% off the annual plan. That's less than $15 for an entire year of content. So if you want to watch the full Narcos Season 1 review right now, just go over to curiositystream.com/historybuffs. Narcos then jumps forward to 1980, and we see the fruits of Escobar's labor that would help build the greatest drug cartel in the world. No longer cooking in the barrios, the drug lords would move on to build cocaine factories out in the Amazon jungle, the largest of which was Tranquilandia, an enormous complex of 20 labs and camps with 7 runways and hundreds of workers. It was the size of a small town. Escobar was intent on industrializing the cocaine trade and monopolizing it. From production to trafficking to distribution, everything would be done in-house with no outside middlemen. As a result, Escobar's wealth and power grew exponentially. He was no longer earning millions, but billions. He was earning so much money that it was starting to become an inconvenience. For one thing, Pablo's cover story for the origin of his fortune was laughable. In the show, he uses a taxi company as a front, but in real life, it was a bicycle rental shop that somehow pulled in millions of dollars a week. For him and the other narco kingpins, they were earning more money than they could launder. And what they couldn't launder, they buried. And what they couldn't bury, they spent.
Estás gastando mucha plata, Pablo. Tenés Picassos, Dalís, fincas, casa, apartamentos, lanchas, aviones, carros. Yo siempre te he dicho a vos que tenemos que volar bajo. Si vos seguís comprando así, vas a aparecer en la revista Forbes.
And that's exactly what happened. But not until 1987. But when he did, he held onto that spot as the 7th richest man in the world for 7 years in a row. The reason why Narcos brings up the Ford magazine article earlier to 1981, because that was the year the drug lords and their wealth attracted the attention of M19, a Marxist guerrilla group. And in the show, they get the bright idea to kidnap and ransom the family members of drug lords. The leader and co-founder of the group was Ivan Marino Ospina, and is the basis for the character Ivan the Terrible Torres. And in 1974, his group broke into La Quinta Museum and stole a national treasure, the sword of Simon Bolivar, the Colombian liberator who freed much of South America from the Spanish Empire. This symbol was meant to give M19 an air of legitimacy as freedom fighters. On November the 11th, 1981, they kidnapped Marta Ochoa, the daughter of Don Fabio, and demanded $15 million. For some reason, they changed this date to March 13th, but I couldn't figure out why. Also, what's not mentioned in Narcos is that M19 very nearly kidnapped Carlos Leda too, but he was able to escape. Within a few days, the drug lords of Medellin formed an alliance to fight back against the kidnappers. It was at this moment that the Medellin cartel was born, all under the leadership of Pablo Escobar.
Lo que les estoy proponiendo en este momento, señores, es que formemos una organización. que unamos nuestros recursos para entrenar soldados, para intercambiar conocimientos y para comprar información. Y para que quede muy claro, vamos a llamar nuestro grupo Muerte a Secuestradores. Muerte a Secuestradores.
And just to make sure everyone knew they meant business, on December 3rd, 1981, they had Carlos Lehder airdrop leaflets over 2 football stadiums. The leaflets read, 223 industrialists from all over the country have agreed to form the MAS, Death to Kidnappers. Its objective is the public and systematic execution of anyone who is involved in the heinous crime of kidnapping. One by one, the cartel tracked down and murdered members of M19. In public parks, they hanged their bodies from trees to be posed with signs that read, Death to Kidnappers. The message could have been clearer. M19 buckled against the pressure and released Marto Ochoa without delay. And in Narcos, they take M19's submission a step further by showing a dramatized scene where Ivan the Terrible throws himself at Pablo's mercy and gives him the sword of Simon Bolivar, which Pablo humbly accepts and shows mercy to Ivan. He even promises to work with him in the future. Now, it's a bit of a mystery exactly what happened to the sword. Between 1974, when M19 stole it, to 1991, when they returned it to the Colombian government as part of the peace talks. But according to Pablo Escobar's son, in his book, Pablo Escobar, My Father, M19 did give Pablo the sword, who in turn gave it to his son for his 9th birthday present, until they asked for it back. Juan Pablo wrote the experience by saying, My father had a close relationship with the M19, so close that in 1986, one of the guerrilla leaders gave him the sword of Latin American liberator Simon Bolivar. We kept it until 1991, when my father returned it. Before giving it back, I posed for this photo. Even though this is all dramatized, it's still a good scene, and very authentic to who Pablo Escobar was. He was a man of contradictions. He saw no issue creating an organization to fight kidnappers, even though he himself was a kidnapper. But that was Pablo Escobar. He was not above pushing populist rhetoric and proclaiming self-righteousness when it benefited him, and oftentimes it did. In the eyes of some Colombians, Pablo's fight against the kidnappers legitimized him, and by 1982, Pablo decided to pursue this further by entering politics. He had already promoted himself as a man of the people by spending millions on the city of Medellin, building football stadiums, roads, schools, churches, hospitals, and a housing project for the poor who lived in the slums by the city's dumps, calling it Barrio Pablo Escobar. In no time at all, Pablo became Medellin's most popular citizen amongst the urban poor, with one journalist in particular who referred to him as the Paisa Robin Hood.
Cuéntenos sobre su programa Medellín sin tugurio, señor Escobar.
Pues yo nací en el Río Negro, no muy lejos de aquí. Y yo siempre me he preguntado cómo un gobierno que pues existe para representar a las personas está tan distanciado de la vida de la gente.
Clínicas de salud, programas sociales y atléticos, la construcción de 400 casas en esta comunidad.
So the journalist interviewing him there, Valeria Velez, is based on a real woman called Virginia Vallejo. Just like her character, Virginia was the first one to interview Pablo Escobar, and between 1983 and 1987 became his mistress. And in the beginning, it was a mutually beneficial relationship. Virginia had exclusive access to Pablo for interviews that advanced her career, and Escobar used Virginia to advance his political agenda, to one day becoming president of Colombia itself. His biggest step towards achieving that dream was the election of 1982, when Pablo ran for Congress as a substitute for Jairo Ortega. Reason for being a substitute was to not raise suspicion on the origin of his immense wealth. Now, you can probably guess that Pablo's motives for doing this weren't exactly selfless. Whilst it's true he was a megalomaniac and a narcissist, there was also more to it than that. The most obvious reason was to win hearts and minds, and ensure that the people from his home turf wouldn't sell him out later down the road. It was an investment on Pablo's part that would pay dividends in the future, but it was also tactical.
¿Sabe lo que está haciendo, no? Según la ley colombiana dice que un congresista tiene inmunidad total.
As recently as 1979, Colombia signed a treaty with the United States that called for suspected drug traffickers to be extradited, stand trial, and if convicted, to be imprisoned in America. The threat of extradition was the one thing that terrified Pablo Escobar and the other drug lords. Their standard procedure of bribery and intimidation wasn't going to fly against American justice. When Pablo won the election of 1982, Pablo received parliamentary immunity for all crimes. For further protection, Pablo also spent that year using his platform to pushed for extradition to be banned entirely, by spinning it as a point of national pride that Colombians should only be judged by Colombians and serve their sentences in Colombia. But the impression we get from Narcos is that as soon as Pablo Escobar began his career in politics, he was immediately exposed as a drug lord, which didn't happen until 1983. The man who did expose him was the newly appointed Justice Minister, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, and the show takes a few liberties with his character. For starters, he's introduced as a well-intentioned good man, but he has a moment of weakness and takes a bribe from Pablo Escobar, and this comes back to bite him in the arse when the DEA turns up and hands him Pablo's mugshot when he was arrested in 1976, proving that he has a criminal record. So, needing to get in front of the story and protect himself, Bonilla publicly denounces Pablo as a drug lord in Congress and shows his mugshot. But this is not exactly how it happened. Instead, Pablo told a convicted drug trafficker called Evaristo Porras to disguise himself as a businessman and make a donation of 1 million pesos in Lara Bonilla's name. This was meant to slander him in case he ever went after hot money and the creeping influence it was having in Colombian politics. What Escobar didn't count on was that this would not be enough to deter Lara Bonilla and his accusations of Jairo Ortega's party being tainted by drug money. On August 16, 1983, Escobar came to the Hall of Representatives in Bogota for the first time, and just like we see in Narcos, he was originally refused entry for not wearing a tie, so he had to borrow one. After he was allowed in the chamber, Lara Bonilla directly accused Pablo Escobar of criminal conduct. But unlike in the show, he didn't provide his mugshot as proof. That's why this bit doesn't make sense.
Quiero informar a la opinión pública que el señor ministro de Justicia tiene un plazo de 24 horas para que presente las pruebas concretas de la indicación que me hizo en el día de ayer en la Cámara de Representantes.
Then what was the mugshot then? You need more proof than that? Truth is, the mugshot didn't come into play until days after Lara's accusation. It was not the DEA, but the newspaper El Espectador who found it in their archives, and they published it in an article. And it was so damning that Pablo tried to buy every single copy in Medellin, but to no avail. This effectively killed his political career. Over the next few months, he was kicked out of the party and stripped of his US visa and parliamentary immunity. And then Lara Bonilla went on the offensive against Escobar and the other drug lords. He seized Pablo's illegally imported exotic animals from his Hacienda Nápoles estate, uncovered that 6 of the 9 Colombian football teams were owned by drug lords, and stripped them of their ownership. He denied permits for their planes and signed an arrest and extradition order against Carlos Leder, who went into hiding. But Lara Bonilla's biggest blow against the drug lords came in March 1984, when he authorized the Colombian National Police, with the assistance of the DEA, to raid Tranquilandia. The DEA were able to find it by placing satellite tracking devices on barrels of ether that were purchased from New Jersey. The CNP arrested hundreds of workers, destroyed 7 planes, 12,000 chemical drums, and seized 13.8 metric tons of cocaine, worth over $1 billion. It was one of the biggest drug busts in history. That was when Pablo Escobar finally had enough of Lara Bonilla and put a contract on him. Then on April 30th, 1984, Pablo Sicarios, his assassins, found him in northern Bogota in a chauffeur-driven Mercedes and opened fire. Now, in Narcos, Lara Bonilla is killed before the raid in Tranquilandia in episode 4. In real life, a major reason why he died was because of it.
Esta es una operación que ha tenido un resultado inmejorable y que da una idea de la dimensión del problema del narcotráfico en el país.
But in any case, Lara Bonilla's murder shocked Colombia to its core. This was unprecedented. To give you an idea of its significance, it would be like if someone assassinated the US Attorney General in DC. By killing the Justice Minister, Pablo Escobar had declared war against the Colombian state, triggering one of the bloodiest decades in its history. After the murder of Lara Bonilla in 1984, the Colombian government finally realized just how powerful the cartels had become. Now that they were the ones being targeted, there was an added emphasis to enforce extradition more than ever. If Pablo thought things were just going to end with Lara Bonilla, he was wrong. One man's crusade would become government policy, and soon hundreds of drug traffickers would be arrested nationwide. Pablo instantly regretted his mistake because just days after Bonilla's murder, he and the Medellin cartel leaders fled to Panama, where they were promised sanctuary by Manuel Noriega, the country's future dictator. In Narcos, though, this doesn't happen until 5 years later, in 1989. Once they safely settled down in Panama, Pablo reached out to the Colombian government to try and negotiate a deal where he and the others could return from exile without being arrested. Weeks later, on May 29, 1984, Pablo Escobar and Jorge Ochoa met with former Colombian President Alfonso Lopez at the Hotel Marriott, and, according to urban legend, they made an extraordinary offer.
We offer the repatriation of our capital abroad to boost the national economy and also pay our country's external debt, presently estimated at $12 billion. In exchange, we request amnesty and the guarantee that under no circumstances, we will be extradited to another country for any illicit activities that may have occurred to date.
You heard that right. Pablo Escobar and the other drug lords offered to pay off Colombia's national debt if they were let go. Not only that, but they offered to go straight and dismantle their entire operation. There must have been some politicians who attempted, at least for a moment, but politically it would be unacceptable. There was just too much anger over the justice minister's death, and Pablo had crossed the line. To accept a deal like this would have been to make one with the devil. Despite this fact, Escobar continued to insist to the media that he was innocent and not a drug trafficker. But just a month later, on June 25, 1984, Pablo would resurface in Nicaragua, and the world would catch him red-handed, and it was all thanks to an American named Barry Seal. Now, in the show, Barry Seal is a former CIA pilot who works for the Medellin cartel flying their coke. Steve Murphy and Javier Pena arrest him on not just drug trafficking, but also for making refueling stops in communist countries like Nicaragua and Cuba. And Barry Seal just so happens to have the most incriminating photo of Pablo Escobar just lying about.
Well, see, I figured this day might come. But you uncuff me, boys. I got something to show you.
This is not how it happened. Barry Seal was a former commercial airline pilot who smuggled coke for the cartel and was busted by the DEA in Florida in March 1983. Facing a 10-year sentence, Barry offered to turn informants for a reduced sentence and promised to give them Pablo Escobar on a silver platter. In a combined sting operation between the DEA and CIA, Barry Seal landed in Managua, Nicaragua with a C-123 plane to pick up 750 kilos of coke, and on board were hidden cameras that took pictures of Pablo Escobar personally loading coke onto the plane as well as Nicaraguan soldiers.
Why does that matter? Because at the time, Nicaragua was governed by the communist Sandinistas, who were letting Escobar use their country as a landing strip for cocaine shipments to the U.S. Colombian cocaine coming through a communist country and into America? I couldn't have made that up.
Now, the DEA wanted to use Barry Seal to later lure Pablo Escobar into a trap and arrest him. That was the original plan, but once Washington saw those pictures, they were more interested in discrediting the Sandinistas and leaked them, jeopardizing the entire DEA operation and blowing Barry Seal's cover.
This picture, secretly taken at a military airfield outside Managua, shows Federico Vaughn, a top aide to one of the 9 commandantes who rule Nicaragua, loading an aircraft with illegal narcotics bound for the United States.
That's your fucking face, Barry!
This is.
It wasn't just Washington who screwed Barry Seal. When he returned to court to receive his reduced sentence, the judge hated the deal and the fact he couldn't incarcerate him. So he gave him the harshest sentence he could, which was 6 months probation in Baton Rouge with no guns and no armed bodyguards. Barry was ordered to reside at the Salvation Army Community Treatment Center and turn up every night at 6 p.m. and not leave until 6 a.m. Then the judge read out the address in open court. It was basically a death sentence.
Being a rat is a dangerous business, and Escobar's reach was long. Barry Seal refused federal protection, and he met his end in a parking lot in Baton Rouge. Whoops.
Following his close shave in Nicaragua and being betrayed by Manuel Noriega in Panama, Pablo Escobar decided that for all his troubles, he was probably safer in Colombia than out of it. That's when he flew home and settled in for a long fight against the government. He was going to do it by creating a new organization. Like Death to Kidnappers, the name was going to speak for itself, the Extraditables. Its only mission was to get extradition banned. They sent letters to newspapers, TV stations, and courtrooms promising to kill anyone who supported extradition. Judges were especially targeted. More than 30 would be assassinated by 1985. Just like we see in the show, so many judges were being killed that faceless courts were created to protect their identities and those of witnesses. They also stopped using juries as people were too scared to serve in drug trials. But Escobar's greatest strike against the judicial system came on November 6, 1985, when he paid M19 $1 million to raid the Palace of Justice in Bogota. That's the Colombian Supreme Court. The guerrillas stormed the palace and held all 24 of Colombia's chief court justices and hundreds more hostage, making many demands. One of them was to renounce extradition, but the government refused to negotiate and sent in the army. The siege lasted for 2 days and resulted in the deaths of over 100 people, as well as 11 of the 24 Supreme Court justices. In the carnage, the guerrillas set a fire in the evidence room that destroyed thousands of files used to determine the extradition of drug traffickers. Now, one creative change Narcos makes is that Pablo Escobar recruits Ivan the Terrible, the M19 leader, to personally carry out the raid, and Ivan, along with a few other survivors, managed to escape. But just as they're being paid, Pablo double-crosses Ivan and kills them all. The truth is that none of the M19 rebels survived the Palace of Justice, and Pablo couldn't betray Ivan the Terrible because he was already dead. He was gunned down by the cops in Cali in August 1985. But in any case, the Palace of Justice siege terrified everyone who works in public life. The list of people willing to speak out against the traffickers was getting smaller by the day. Pablo had a long memory and even longer reach. On December 17, 1986, Guillermo Cano, the editor-in-chief of El Espectador, who published Pablo's mugshot that got him kicked out of politics, was gunned down in his car. By the end of 1986, even the Colombian Supreme Court were scared enough to try and appease Pablo by declaring extradition invalid due to a technicality. For a brief moment, it looked like he won, but a few days later, the treaty was quickly re-signed by President Bentancur. But that moment of weakness was enough to convince Pablo his tactics were working. All he had to do was to keep up the pressure. By episode 5, the show jumps forward to 1989, and from this point on, it never outright says what year it is again. Despite this, I'll continue providing dates for all the events we see. Just don't be confused if my timeline is different from that of Narcos. But back to 1989. This is when the situation in Colombia was turning into a powder keg. Medellin would transform into the most dangerous city in the world, with over 5,000 murders a year. The authorities were so overwhelmed at times, they could take days to clear a corpse off the street, and yet the violence continued to escalate. But one major thing Narcos doesn't mention, or rather changes to happen later, is that by 1989, the Medellin cartel was fighting a war on two fronts, one against the state and one against another cartel, the Cali cartel. The difference between Medellin and Cali couldn't be more night and day. Whilst Pablo solved all his problems through fear and violence, the so-called gentlemen of Cali solved theirs through bribes and blackmail, and preferred to use violence as a last resort. It was just bad for business and too high profile. As well as running the second largest cartel in the world, they also invested in legitimate businesses. They ran the biggest chain of pharmacies in Colombia and even controlled their own bank. In the early days, peace was maintained between the cartels through a mutual respect of territory within the United States. The deal was that Cali got New York and Medellin got Los Angeles, and they both agreed to share Miami and Houston because they were port cities. But in Narcos, for some reason, the deal is different. Instead, Medellin gets Miami, Cali gets New York, and they both agreed to share Los Angeles, and the troubles start when Cali intrudes on Pablo's turf.
Vea, Pacho, nosotros habíamos quedado que íbamos a compartir el territorio de Los Ángeles. Y eso no está pasando, hermano.
Pues parece que ustedes no están cumpliendo con lo que habíamos acordado.
¿Cómo así? Lo que le estoy diciendo, Pacho.
¿Sabe lo que me molesta a mí? Su arrogancia. Su actitud de superioridad. Pacho, que no lo vayan a quebrar por eso.
In real life, though, it wasn't Cali who were the instigators, but Escobar. Not only was he muscling in on their turf in New York, but he also had a personal beef with Pacho Herrera, one of the Cali godfathers. It started in New York when a Colombian trafficker called Jorge Blackie Pabon got out of prison and found out his girlfriend was cheating on him with another trafficker called Pineapple. I swear I'm not making these names up. So wanting revenge, Blackie asked Pablo for permission to kill him because Pineapple was under protection from the Cali cartel. Pablo called Cali and demanded he be handed over, but Pacho Herrera refused.
This disagreement started and they start talking They found out that he was ready to kill my dad and uncle and the other members of the cartel. My uncle told him, "You piece of garbage, this is the last time we talk because one of us has to die." And then in '88, we had a little war against Escobar.
On January 13th, 1988, Cali launched a preemptive strike against Escobar. They learned his family resided at the Monaco building in Medellin and assumed he'd be with them. It was an empty, unregistered apartment block built specifically to be their safe house. The car bomb had been packed with over 300 kilos of dynamite that left a 13-foot hole in the street below. The blast killed 2 passers-by, ripped up water mains, and shattered windows 4 blocks away. Despite the destruction, Pablo's family miraculously survived, but it did leave his 4-year-old daughter Manuela permanently deaf in one ear. The only inaccuracies here is that the bombing didn't take place in 1989 like in the show, and Pablo wasn't in the building at the time, but I don't think any of us have an issue with that last bit, because the drama is very well done here. The Monaco building was a watershed moment for Escobar. He had 2 enemies now, the state and Cali. For a single bomb directed at his family gave Pablo the excuse to unleash hundreds in a massive campaign of terror.
Unable to lash out directly at his enemies in Cali, he went after their prized legitimate business, one they couldn't hide, their beloved chain of drugstores. And he blew them to shit along with anyone unlucky enough to be standing nearby.
Between 1988 and 1990, Pablo blew up 85 pharmacies and several radio stations owned by the Cali cartel. Of course, this doesn't get mentioned until season 2, but trust me, 1988 was the year when things really escalated. Regular Colombians had already grown used to reading about killings in the newspapers, but now Pablo's wars were spilling out in the streets outside their homes. So by 1989, the Colombian people were growing increasingly exhausted by all the violence. Public opinion demanded that something be done with the cartels, but not since Lara Bonilla had anyone really championed the cause. But there was a glimmer of hope in the coming election with Liberal Party candidate for president, Luis Galan. He was a popular reformer whose entire platform was to rid Colombia of corruption and extradite the drug traffickers. Luis Galan would not be cowed by the likes of Escobar, and the people pinned their hopes on him to lead them out of the darkness. On August 18, 1989, Luis Galan campaigned in Soacha against the advice of his campaign manager, Cesar Gaviria. Just weeks before, Galan had already survived one attempt on his life when a Sicario tried to fire an RPG at him. Nevertheless, Galan took to the stage in front of 10,000 of his supporters. Once again, Pablo Escobar had snuffed out the light. The nation mourned Galan's murder, and thousands took to the streets in silent protest. A few days later, at the funeral, Galan's son, Juan Manuel, was delivering a eulogy, and at the end, implored Cesar Gaviria to take his father's place in the presidential election and his anti-narco policy, and Cesar Gaviria did, knowing full well that he would be targeted next. And on November 27, 1989, he was. 2 weeks earlier, Pablo and his top capos were planning Gaviria's assassination after learning he was scheduled to fly to Cali. They then recruited a young man out of the barrio and tricked him to bring a briefcase aboard the plane that he thought was a recording device. He was instructed to turn it on after the plane took off and secretly tape the conversation of the passenger next to him. Instead, it was a 5-kilo bomb. Avianca Flight 203 crashed into the side of a mountain on the outskirts of Bogota. All 107 passengers and crew were killed, but by a stroke of luck, Gaviria hadn't been on board. Due to the threat on his life, his chief of security changed flights at the last minute. The Avianca bombing left Colombia reeling with horror and despair. The country was under attack by a madman who was willing to kill 107 people just to kill one man. Life was cheap to Escobar, and he proved it again just 9 days later with an even bigger attack. Outside the DAS building headquarters, his sicarios left a bus outside carrying 500 kilos of dynamite. The target was again just one man, DAS Director General Miguel Maza Marquez. He escaped unharmed, but the bus killed 70 people and injured over 1,000. Galan's killing, the Avianca and DAS bombings proved that Pablo Escobar wasn't just a threat to Colombia, but to world security. Because 2 Americans died on the Avianca flight, President Bush pledged $65 million in emergency military aid to Colombia, as well as send US Special Forces to train its police and military. Then, in a televised address, he had this to say:
And our message to the drug cartels is this: the rules have changed. We will help any government that wants our help. When requested, we will, for the first time, make available the appropriate resources of America's armed forces. We will
Me está oyendo, ¿cierto?
Ese se está fumando esa mierda. Se lo garantizo.
Well, that wraps up part 1 of my Season 1 review for Narcos. Stay tuned for part 2 when it comes out next week. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching, History Buffs.